Okay. Good. Okay. All right, you guys can hear me. You can see the presentation. Just give me a thumbs up. People on Zoom. People at home.
You need to be you need to be close to the microphone. You need to be
closer to the microphone.
Yeah, can you just table? I have a small table recording.
No. Just.
Okay.
We're gonna move the microphone up so it's a little bit closer to my face.
You need to be close to your laptop.
Can you hear me at home?
No, listen to me. Hold it. Listen to me. You need to be close to your laptop.
I'm Sternberg. I'm the Culper Spy Ring historian for the Drowned Meadow Cottage Museum in downtown Port Jefferson, New York. It is called the Drowned Meadow Cottage Museum because that was the colonial name for Port Jefferson. The home itself belonged to Phillips Rowe, one of the members of Washington's Culper Spy Ring. And but today I'm going to be focusing more on Selah Strong. I've been doing a lot of research on the Rowes, finding out more about their role in the Culper Spy Ring, but it ended up leading up with a lot more information also about Selah Strong and his involvement. And what we're going to be doing today is talking about these new primary sources that I found and their significance. And a lot of them you've seen referenced in my article in the fall. So I'm going to talk about them a little bit more in depth than I could in the article. And then I'm also going to be talking about one new reveal for tonight that I found 2 months ago that should be kind of interesting. And also to break it up a little bit, we're going to have some advanced Culper Spy Ring trivia. You guys are all Culper Spy Ring fans, right? So I don't need to give you the basics, you already know them. So it's going to be a little bit harder, and I'll see how everyone makes sense. A little bit about me. I helped find, I was the one that found the letter of significance back in 2013. The letter of significance, we call it that because it ties Phillips Rowe specifically to the Culper Spy Ring. It was a letter from the loyalist Nehemiah Marks identifying Nathaniel and Phillips Rowe. Nathaniel was Phillips Rowe's brother, as they were giving intelligence to Caleb Brewster at Drowned Meadow. When my wife and I moved out to Long Island with the COVID pandemic, I began getting more interested in wanting to get engaged with the cottage and began doing additional research to show us some new information. If you come by the cottage, we're open during Port Jefferson major events, but we plan to be open more regularly. But just to give you an idea for those of you who haven't visited the cottage, the new information we found that there were Culper Spy Ring related documents from the American Revolution, hidden in the chimney of Phillips Rowe. And it was only discovered when his house was moved the first time in 1867. They found documents wrapped in a cloth from the American Revolution. And they didn't know why they were there, but nowadays, knowing that they're part of the Culper Spy Ring, we can kind of see how they fit into the larger puzzle. I also found a letter at the Suffolk County Historical Society in Riverhead. It was a letter from George Smith, and it was to John Rowe Jr. It was Austin Rowe, the courier's brother. The letter was a letter of introduction for a Hessian informant, an informant who was on the American side, but he was in the Hessian army. He was an auxiliary, German auxiliary. And the letter is sending that informant out to John Rowe Jr. for John Rowe Jr. to put this informant on the next vote to Talmadge. Apparently, Talmadge, Washington, and Congress are all waiting for this very important informant. Finally, what's really cool is we have a deposition from Caleb Brewster talking about the patriotism of Nathaniel Rowe Jr. Again, Nathaniel Rowe Jr. is brother of Phillips Rowe. Phillips and Nathaniel are both first cousins of Austin Rowe, the courier. And Caleb Brewster talks about the time when he was aboard a ship with other troops. American troops were about to come into Port Jeff Harbor. The ship was intercepted by the HMS Falcon. There's a chase. The Skylar ends up crashing on Cedar Beach in Mount Sinai. And the British tried to capture all of the Americans aboard, but a couple escaped. Caleb Brewster and a couple of men escaped by fleeing to Nathaniel Rowe Jr.'s house. And Nathaniel Rowe Jr. hid him in his cellar until the next morning when they were able to rejoin in another American company. So pretty cool stuff. I recommend you come by. But again, we're not talking so much about the Drowned Meadow Cottage today as we are about Selah Strong. Everyone's a huge fan of Selah. And I was more than excited to find new information about him and specifically his role in the Culper Spy Ring. What we're going to be looking at today are a variety of primary sources. Some are letters, some are like codifications of boats. And some are, and these are actually the most informative, pensions. So one of the interesting resources that hasn't been utilized enough is pensions from people that served during the revolution. And what happens is when back in like in the 1800s, Congress finally decided that they should compensate with a pension a lot of these American Revolutionary veterans. And in order to get a pension, those veterans had to say, here are the things I did during the revolution. And sometimes they can be extremely informative. And we're going to talk about some of the more informative ones today. Before I get into it, not all of these are absolutely brand new. The ones that I label as new, I've done years of research at this point. I've never seen cited in any source in any of the books about the Culper Spy Ring. Obscure is something I may have seen cited once in one source ever, but it's important to bring it up for a specific reason. Uncommon may have been published once or twice. And corrected is a primary source that was materially misrepresented to the extent that it didn't even sort of capture the point of it in the first place. So we're going to start off talking about Long Island as just after the Battle of Bunker Hill, June 17, 1775. After this, the British flee to Canada. And but the people here on Long Island knew where the British were going to attack next. They were going to be coming for New York. So here on Long Island, everyone was starting to prepare for war. And we learned a lot from a very interesting pension, as I was talking about. This is a pension of a man named Jeremiah Kinner. Jeremiah Kinner served as the private in Captain Selah company. Now, a little bit about pensions. They're in the National Archives, but you can actually access them via Fold 3. A lot of you have access to Live Library via the Suffolk County Library System. So definitely go to library.com and you can access Fold 3 and check all these out for yourself. But Jeremiah Kinner was private in Captain Selah company. Selah's company was stationed on his property at Mount Misery. For those of you that aren't familiar with Mount Misery, that's modern-day Belterre, Harvard Hills. It's sort of that peninsula on the eastern side of Port Jefferson Harbor. And yeah, you'll also see that Caleb Brewster. This is an interesting little tidbit. Jeremiah Kinner served in that company, but it was and Selah should have been at the Battle of Long Island as part of Josiah Smith's regiment, but instead Caleb Brewster had to lead it as Selah himself was homesick with the fever. So a little bit more to the Culper Spy Ring story early on. So we're going to start off with the first trivia question. Jeremiah Kinner was the brother of which member of Caleb Brewster's whaleboat crew? Okay, maybe this question's a little too hard. All right, so it's Jonathan Kinner. He served on Caleb Brewster's whaleboat crew, specifically mentioned by Washington to James Clinton. And he also, there's a pension for Jonathan Kinner as well that talks about his service serving alongside Caleb Brewster as one of his whaleboat men. Highly recommend you guys check it out on Fold 3.
Could you speak closer to your microphone in the laptop?
Okay, let's get a little bit closer to the microphone. Oh, it's this microphone.
Oh, that's much better. Much better.
This one's the one that's working. Okay.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, just trying to make sure everyone can hear.
Okay, we'll stand.
Okay. All right. Okay. Don't move. All right. The next big event, we have the Battle of Long Island. And that happens August 27, 1776. And that's really a game changer for Long Island. After the Battle of Long Island, Manhattan and Long Island become British occupied territory. Now, this is a brand new document. This I found 2 months ago. It's never been cited in any source before, but it's really interesting for our purposes. And what is it? It's a letter from Richard Platt to Colonel John Lamb in June 6 of 1777. Richard Platt was from Huntington. I believe he's from Huntington. He's definitely from Long Island. He mentioned specifically that he knew Brewster before the war. This is about Caleb Brewster. And he's writing a letter to Colonel John Lamb. So what you might ask me, why were you looking into John Lamb papers? Well, if you know about Caleb Brewster and you know his rank and where he was serving, he was part of John Lamb's company. So it was worth taking a look to see if there was anything about Caleb Brewster in the John Lamb papers. And sure enough, there were. And this was probably the most interesting piece that I found. Again, it's on microfilm at the New York Historical Society in New York City. But what we find out is that Richard Platt, he's an aide-de-camp to Alexander McDougall, is writing to John Lamb of the 2nd Artillery Regiment about Ensign Caleb Brewster. Now, you may have heard me say before that Caleb Brewster was a lieutenant. He was lieutenant in Josiah Smith's company, but a lot of people that were on these Long Island militias got overlooked, let's say, when they had to join the Continental Army later. And even though he had a lieutenancy before, H.B. Livingston only recommended Brewster as an ensign. Brewster was supposed to be up for a lieutenancy in Rodolphus Ritzma's regiment, but Brewster fell sick and never joined. Now, what's interesting here, though, for our purposes, when we're talking about the Culper Spy Ring, is the very last sentence of the letter that I'll show you over here. But Brewster has orders specifically from General Israel Putnam to go to Long Island to gain intelligence, and presumably, as the bearer of this letter, delivers this letter along the way. Now, what's cool about that is here we have Caleb Brewster specifically being ordered to go to Long Island to gain intelligence in June of 1777. That is more than a year before most historians accept that the Culper Spy Ring began. So it's an interesting question, right? When does the Culper Spy Ring really begin? If the same group of people were spying before spying for Washington specifically, is it still the Culper Spy Ring? It's an interesting question that is worth examining. And here, if you take a look, it's kind of hard to see here, but it says in that very last line there, he, being Brewster, is now on his way to Long Island to obtain, it's hard to read right here, by General Putnam to gain intelligence. But if anyone wants to see it, I can show you. It's a little bit harder for solution here. But anyway, kicking off our second trivia question. Which brigadier general in General Putnam's division did members of the future Culper Spy Ring correspond with? Okay, these trivia questions are too hard. Brigadier General Samuel Holden Parsons. We know that specifically, if you look at George Washington's letter to Caleb Brewster on August 11, 1778, Washington says specifically that he says to Caleb Brewster, I saw the letters you sent to Parsons and reviewed them. But also, we'll talk a little bit about a letter from Richard Hewlett to William Tryon. Richard Hewlett was the loyalist captain, the loyalist commander of the fort here in Setauket, and he sent a letter to the loyalist governor, William Tryon, after our next big event, the Battle of Setauket. So the Battle of Setauket happens later that summer, August 22nd, 1777. And that's the first time we see that Selah really gets exposed as a spy. This letter, as I was mentioning, is from Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hewlett, a loyalist, to William Tryon, the loyalist governor, on September 3rd, 1777, not too long after that Battle of Setauket. You have, just to know where this is in the Henry Clinton papers, sort of the British side of the documents for the Revolution at Clements Library at the University of Michigan. I've seen it cited only a handful of times, Bev. I think you may have cited it in one of your articles. But again, it's so good to go over because we just learned so much about the Culper Spy Ring from this particular article, and at least it's like proto-Culper Spy Ring. We have that Richard Hewlett, had this incident while writing the following authentic information lodged against Justice Selah Strong by a gentleman from Connecticut that he wrote to General Parsons. Strong has repeatedly sent intelligence to the rebels in Connecticut of the situation of his troops in this place by John and Cornelius Clark. This very Mr. Strong has pretended to be our friend and several times given information of the last named persons being over, but not until they were gone. There's two cool things about that. We learned that not only are the members of this Culper Spy Ring pretending to be loyalists, not too much of a surprise, but it's good to have confirmation, but also that Selah Strong was reporting on the people that were coming over, John and Cornelius Clark, but not until he knew that they were safely away. Something I've also heard, and I've seen in a couple of documents here and there, is that there seems to be some debate over whether Dr. Samuel Thompson, you guys all know the Thompson House, was actually here during the war. It's kind of odd, but to clarify that Hewlett specifically mentioned Samuel Thompson in his tirade against all of these people who were involved. And he says that Samuel Thompson, at the time of the Battle of Setauket, was actually spreading rumors that the British that the Loyalists had already lost. So it's clear that he was here and doing his own part as a patriot here in the area. Another thing that's interesting is, I've also heard rumors or stories that the Caroline Church served as a hospital during the Battle of Setauket, but that doesn't seem to be the case. When you look at Hewlett's letter, he mentions that our hospital was at some distance from the works, as there was not a convenient house near. As you know, the Caroline Church is directly next to where the fort was, and where the fort was on the village green. So I'll show you in a little bit about where they were located in relation to each other, the hospital to the village green. Here's a copy of the letter. There's a transcription that I can send you there if anyone's interested. But let's talk a little bit about that hospital, right? Who owned this hospital and what was it designed for? Okay. Great. Okay, so these questions are too hard. I'm sorry. So it's actually owned by Dr. George Merson. This is Samuel Holland's map from 1778. So that hospital was owned by Dr. George Merson, and we know that he was making hospitals around the island. He made one in Shelter Island as well for smallpox inoculations. Dr. George Merson was quite famous for creating a better method of smallpox inoculations.
Where was that hospital?
It's sort of like Oldfield. So if you're here, you can see a little bit here. It's kind of hard to see, but A is the redoubt. That was the Loyalist fort. The Caroline Church is shown directly next to it. But as you can see, to get to the hospital is quite a ways away. And just to show you a bigger version of this map, this map we have on display in the Drowned Meadow Cottage Museum. It's super informative. You'll see that Setauket at the time was a much larger area, from about Stony Brook to Mount Sinai, Old Lands, and you'll see, Seaton's Neck. Andrew Seaton owned that property during the war of the Loyalists. And you can see Setauket Harbor referred to like Port Jeff as well. This is Port Jeff in the bottom right. At that point, it would be called Drowned Meadow. And if you had a better resolution, which you can click on that link there for those at home, you can see, it identifies certain local loyalists that the British and the Loyalists would stay with, Loyalist armies were quartered with. Anyway, and so one thing I haven't mentioned is that I'm an attorney, so I'm kind of fastidious when it comes to facts, and it really does help research when you get facts exactly right. So here's the question. What specific crime was Selah Strong arrested for, and in what specific jail was he imprisoned?
Someone answered it online.
Okay, great. What is it?
They said being a spy.
Surreptitious.
Okay.
Sugar house.
Okay, so I haven't heard the right answer yet.
Surreptitious.
No. So okay. So this is why it's important. So he was actually arrested for treasonable correspondence with His Majesty's enemies. Surreptitious correspondence with His Majesty's enemies was actually really the only time it ever came up was a mistranslation from Frederick Gregory Mather in Mather's Refugees. If you look up surreptitious correspondence with His Majesty's enemies, the only thing that ever comes up is actually Selah Strong. But the thing is when you get it absolutely right, by going back to the primary source, in January 3rd, 1778, the Royal Gazette made by James Rivington, you can actually learn a lot more about the specific crime. And you're right, it is a crime about spying. It's the civilian version of the crime of spying. And you learn so much about that and sort of see what the rules are from it if you know what the exact crime is. And he didn't end up in a sugar house, he didn't end up on the Jersey, he ended up in the Provost under the cruel hand of William Cunningham, one of the most barbaric people during the Revolutionary War. And it's important to do that as well because we do have surviving records to the Provost. I haven't been able to find a record yet of Selah Strong specifically in that prison, just because I haven't had a record from the Provost at the time he was in prison, but it leads me in the right direction to know exactly where he was at the time. But we know that he went to jail, right? But how long was Selah Strong in jail? We don't actually know, but we do have a count because we have him serving as a Justice of the Peace. There's a document here from the Justice of the Peace of Brookhaven to the Loyalist Governor, William Tryon. on June 23rd, 1778. So to put things in perspective, that's still 2 months before the Culper Spy Ring is at least officially supposed to have started. So he was free at the time. Selah Strong had returned to Setauket and resumed his role as a justice of the peace. Selah and Selah, again, there before the Culper Spy Ring started. And if you take a look, you can see him serving alongside other justices of the peace: Richard Woodhull, Gilbert Smith, Thomas Helms, Isaac Overton. And what they're doing is it's a certification of a vote to send Joseph Brewster and Benjamin Floyd to correspond with Tryon. It was rough being out here on Long Island during the Revolution, and they were sending people to correspond to Tryon to get better conditions. They were getting attacked by patriot privateers. They were getting ransacked by foraging parties from the British. They wanted help, and that's why they were sending people to talk to Tryon. But here you can see Selah Strong's signature here at the bottom, again, June 23rd, 1778. Selah Strong there. And for a signature reference, I used a order from him that's part of the William Clark pension. William Clark was his lieutenant early on, and you can see that the signatures match. It was an order for William Clark to go to Blue Point and guard Blue Point. Trivia question 5. Members of the Culper Spy Ring spied on this commanding officer of the Loyalist fort at Setauket, who, ironically, is also credited with saving Yale from William Tryon's fiery draft. Now, I know there were a couple of commanders of the fort at Setauket, but I'm talking specifically the one that stopped William Tryon. Sorry. And then Fanning. You might recognize part of his name, and this is also, he's apparently appearing in Outlander now. It's in season 4 or 5, but and that's an original picture on the left. But and yeah, he was specifically mentioned in letters to Parsons from spies here on Long Island. But what's interesting is, a lot of you probably watched Turn, right? And you probably said, "Oh, why is he called Edmund Hewlett?" Well, the name is probably a composite of the two. The real name of the Loyalist commander at Setauket during the Battle of Setauket was Richard Hewlett, but there was also Richard Woodhull in the show, so they probably opted to change his name to Edmund from Edmund Fanning, so that there wouldn't be confusion among viewers when they were talking about Richard. Now, we know that Selah Strong didn't spend that much time in prison, 6 months. I mean, it was probably unbearable for him, but in reality, he was still free when this Culper Spy Ring started. But part of the mythology was that he not only spent a lot of time in prison, he then suddenly fled to Connecticut. Well, the thing is we only have one source that he fled to Connecticut. And as you can see, that one was mistranscribed. And that's pretty important when you see it. We're going to talk about the document that served as a basis for it and how it ended up being mistranscribed. What we're talking about is a request from Benjamin Talmadge. Benjamin Talmadge is writing a letter to the Patriot Governor, Jonathan Trumbull, and you can find it at the Connecticut State Library amongst the Trumbull papers. But what it is a pass, and it's a request for a pass for Mrs. Shelton and Mrs. Strong to pass to visit friends and family. And Talmadge goes on to say in the letter, "I am well acquainted with both of the above mentioned ladies." Furthermore, and this I'll explain to you in a second, he says they each have aged parents at Brookhaven. So when we go and look at the original letter, we see that yes, it's from March 20th, 1781, and it's Mrs. Shelton and Mrs. Strong. If you can look more closely at the letter, you'll see that there's sort of like and it's hard to see here, but there's a little lip missing, and that probably was what led to mistranscription. It does look vaguely like Mr., but the rest of the letter makes it perfectly clear. And also, Talmadge does have this tendency when he writes Mrs. to leave off a little lip that sort of repeats the S on the miss. But yeah, so you might be wondering, well, how did this lead to a mistranscription? Well, let's talk about it. So this first sort of like transcribed and abbreviated in part by Henry Amido in 1840, his Revolutionary Incidents of Suffolk and Kings Counties in 1849. And you can see March 20th, 1781, Mrs. Shelton and Mr. Strong living at Stratford who wished to visit each parents. So again, it's a mistranscription of this earlier document. What happens next after 1849 is Frederick Gregory Mather writes Refugees of 1776, and specifically citing Mondrian, he says it himself, but he embellishes on it a little bit. He thinks he knows better. He says, oh, I know a Mrs. Shelton and then a Mr. Strong. Selah Strong's sister married a Shelton. That must be Mrs. William Shelton. And then Mr. Captain Selah Strong himself. And here you can start to see now, oh, well, if he's requesting a pass to come back, then he must have fled to Connecticut in the first place. But it turns out it was all started from a simple mistranscription of this original document. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about, another pension that I found. And okay, so now we know Caleb Brewster wasn't imprisoned to the extent that would prevent him from joining the Culper Spy Ring or assisting it. And then at the same time, he never fled to Connecticut. There's no evidence that he ever left Setauket for Connecticut. So the question is what did he do as part of the Culper Spy Ring then? And we get a great answer. And it comes from one of Caleb Brewster's other whaleboat men, a guy named Robert Brush, in his pension application for 1835. He lived for a long time. Again, you can find it on fold 3. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about what this pension application teaches us about Brewster, though, because you know what happened is Robert Brush had a very hard time getting his pension application approved. So he had to be extremely specific, which is great for us. Like we learned so much from this application. First, he says, I served under Caleb Brewster for 2 months out of each year, from 1778 to 1782. Robert Brush himself was born in Huntington and then resided in Norwalk, Connecticut in 1777, which is where Brewster recruited him to serve on his secret intelligence committee. Brewster and his men would stay for at least, he talked about them coming over to Long Island, and he says that Brewster and his men would stay for at least 2 days on Long Island, and sometimes up to weeks. He also talks a little bit about some various incidents that are kind of cool. They talk about battles with privateers. They talk about a close call they had with Captain Israel Youngs in the 17th Regiment. And they also talk about being trapped on Long Island during an incredible snowstorm. And this, so before we finish up with this, I do want to do two trivia questions. First, Caleb Brewster got in a tangle with the lieutenant of the 17th Regiment. What is the French term for members of this class of cavalry? Yes, yes. Nice. There you go. No stop. All right. And here's a picture of dragoons from the 17th Regiment, and as they would appear. It's a type of cavalry, but cavalry is people serving on horseback. Dragoons are specifically taught to fight on horseback and on foot, but I don't know exactly. I think it's just a type of it as opposed to being a distinction. But another question that we talked a little bit about that snowstorm. Who paid for the supplies for Caleb Brewster and his whaleboat men during that snowstorm? Oh, Samuel Culper Sr. It actually shows up in the last receipt to John Bolton in 1783. So you can see 2 ditto for supplies for Captain Brewster. When here in distress of bad weather, he's giving Culper Jr. Abraham Woodall, Culper Sr. Abraham Woodall lent 6 pounds, 12 shillings, and 6 pence. But what's cool about here too, also on this receipt, you can see GS at the top, George Smith lending, being lent 4 pounds, and SS Selah Strong being lent 4 pounds as well. But let's get to the real meat of this Robert Brush's pension application. This is a deposition from him. And this is what we learned about Selah. Brewster and his whaleboat crew usually started and landed on the island during the night, and taking up their boat into the woods, they lay under it if the weather was inclement, and if it was safe to do so, or conceal themselves somewhere in the neighborhood. Their usual places of landing were Setauket, Stony Brook, a place called the Old Man's, which is modern day Mount Sinai, and Crab Meadow, which is just east of Huntington and Lloyd's Neck. And what he says there is seldom, however, at the latter place being too near the British, which was true. The British had a fortification in Huntington, and they had a whole thing going on in Lloyd's Neck, like a whole fort in Lloyd's Neck. But at the place called the Old Man's, Captain Selah Strong lived, and from him they received such assistance and information as they needed when it was safe for him to do so. But if it was unsafe to do so, or for them to remain there, Strong, by some sign, communicated that fact to Brewster. He remembers many times to have seen Strong pass by their place of concealment as if it were to fodder cattle or to see to some work on his farm, and by a shake of his head as he passed, intimate to him that it was unsafe for them to hold any conversation. So this is really cool. This shows us what Selah Strong's role was for the Culper Spy Ring. He provided a safe space for Caleb Brewster and his crew to hide on his farm on Mount Misery. A little bit about that. He says Old Man's, their house is technically on Mount Misery, but where it sat at the time was much closer to Mount Sinai Harbor than Fort Jeff. So it makes sense that we would call it Old Man's. Again, they didn't own Strong's Neck until after the war. Here's a picture of the pension, and then on the right you can see, like that's a close-up of it. You can see Setauket, they accidentally spelled Setauket with a Q, Stony Brook, Old Man's, and everything else. And of course, you don't want to just take somebody's word for it. You want to make sure that, did somebody testify to his statement? And you can see that Caleb Brewster signed an affidavit to Robert Brush's service. And then Caleb Brewster's daughter, Sarah Brewster, also signed an affidavit testifying to Robert Brush's service with Caleb Brewster. That leads us to trivia question 8. Which local artist was commissioned to create a portrayal of Selah Strong and his sons on their Mount Misery farm? That's right, William Sidney Mount. Caught napping, boys caught napping in the field, made in 1848. And of course, my source is the wonderful book, William Sidney Mount, Family, Friends, and Ideas, made by this historical society. Now you might be wondering, well, if Selah is doing all of this, what was Anna Nancy Strong's role? Well, was she even part of it? Well, we do have an example of her being part of the ring, and we first have to sort of talk about Benjamin Talmadge's captured letters. So I'll start off with a trivia question. Benjamin Talmadge and his men get attacked at Pound Ridge in, is it the Lower Hudson Valley, Westchester? Well, I generally just call anything above New York upstate, but in Pound Ridge, New York, and when he gets attacked, he ends up losing his correspondence. All of these documents, some of which relate to the Culper Spy Ring, all get exposed to the British. Henry Clinton pores over these letters to find out more about Washington's spies. But my question is who was the one that led that attack? Does anyone know?
So small. The Nash.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. It is Colonel Bannister Tarleton. Absolutely right. Anyway, yes, Colonel Bannister Tarleton was the one that led that attack. He not only walked away with all of Benjamin Talmadge's personal correspondence, but he also actually walked away with the colors of Benjamin Talmadge's company. And his family actually had it in the family up until I think 20 years ago, before they came back to the US. But let's talk about one of those captured letters in particular. There is one that Caleb Brewster writes to Benjamin Talmadge on June 21st, 1779, where Caleb Brewster himself mentions talking to Anna Nancy Strong specifically. It is the only Culper letter that mentions Nancy Strong by name. And it's really interesting just for that purpose alone, but it has a couple other cool things about it. First, it mentions that Nancy Strong will be taking care of Benjamin Talmadge's father, Reverend Benjamin Talmadge. There's a lot to the Revolutionary War, and one of those parts was sort of this battle between the various religions that were part of it. And Reverend Talmadge, as being a Presbyterian ministers on Long Island were subject to a lot of harassment. So it was good that Nancy Strong would be keeping an eye out on him. Talmadge was also married to one of the Strong sisters as well, Zipporah. So it's not entirely a surprise that they would be so close. Also, what I found particularly interesting is in the letter, Caleb Brewster also says that he is sending Benjamin Talmadge 12 limes. Scurvy wasn't really an issue during that period, so the limes weren't for that. But it does seem that one of the biggest complaints the members of the Culper Spy Ring always had was that they never had enough invisible ink. Sympathetic stain is what they referred to it as. And it seemed that Benjamin Talmadge may have had the intent of doing a more traditional method of writing invisible ink using limes. The problem with that methodology is it was known and it was easily exposed by laying a letter over it. And that's a picture of the letter on the left. And I don't want to take credit for this. This was discovered by John Navy in his 2011 book, Invisible Ink. I want to give him full credit for it. That man has spent a ton of time in Henry Clinton papers at the University of Michigan. I've heard stories from him from the time that my wife and I actually went there. And yeah, he definitely did a very comprehensive job researching all of the various methods of spying in his book, and talks a lot about the Culper Spy Ring as well. Leads us into trivia question 10. The capture of Benjamin Talmadge's letters led to the immediate imprisonment of what New Yorker? Somebody knows it. Come on. Okay. George Higdon. And here's a picture of the provost as we were talking about before. George Higdon. You see certain levels above ground here. But George Higdon probably wasn't fortunate enough to be on one of the levels above ground. There were dungeons, the provost, where William Cunningham, that cruel provost marshal, beat up his prisoners, trying to get them into false confessions. And that is more likely where George Higdon spent his days as a suspected spy. And so that sort of wraps up, let's sort of wrap up the story. You know, we learn a lot here, right? Selah Strong wasn't in prison for enough time to prevent him from being part of the Culper Spy Ring. He was out before the Culper Spy Ring began. We also see that Selah Strong also never fled to Connecticut. There's no evidence that he ever left here. And we have various documents showing him being here, specifically depositions from privateers that were plundered here. And he was deposed. He would write affidavits on the behalf of people plundered, saying that he was here. But so we have a lot of evidence that he was here the entire time. And not only that, but also, as we can see, Robert brought his own testimony. For more about that article, you can check out that link or scan it here. But yeah, it really shows the importance of going back to primary sources. Simple mistakes can be bundled forward and forward and forward for generations. And so you go back to the primary sources and find out, oh, there's just a simple mistake here that we're just carrying forward. That's why it's so valuable to go back to these primary sources, remember them, keep track of them, because you can learn more from a primary source. And also when secondary sources talk about primary sources, even those people may not realize when something's important. Always go back to your primary sources. They will be your best friend and they will never lie to you. And before I close completely, I do want to make an appeal to all of you here. As you can imagine, I am going through every single document I can get my hands on related to the Culper Spy Ring. But some of those documents end up in private hands. So it's really important, and the picture is of a gentleman, and I'm in contact with him, so don't worry about that, but who posted on Facebook having an account book from 1785. Account books are an extremely important primary source. They tell us what people did for a living, how much money they may have made, and who they dealt with, who they did business with, where they may have been located. You learn so much from it. And it's important for us to know primary sources like this, to have them identified so we can digitize them and future generations will be able to research them and read them. You know, it seems like he may have just pulled it out and slapped it on his kitchen counter for a cool Facebook photo, but it really does serve an important purpose for the people researching and trying to get the fullest picture we can of the Culper Spy Ring and Brookhaven during the Revolutionary War as a whole. Okay.